中国的人工智能安全和治理比人们普遍认为的要先进得多。中国政府和人工智能界非常清楚人工智能带来的风险，并正在努力应对这些风险。因此，国际协调是完全可能的。在这个人工智能与平等播客中，卡内基上广研究员温德尔·瓦拉赫 （Wendell Wallach） 与 Concordia AI 的宽一印和 Bryant Say 讨论了如何利用布莱切利峰会 （Bletchley Summit） 和联合国大会人工智能决议等近期事件的势头，为负责任的人工智能发展建立全球规范和标准。卡内基国际事务伦理委员会是一个独立且无党派的非营利组织。本播客中表达的观点是演讲者的观点，并不一定反映卡内基委员会的立场。
Kuan Yi, as you survey AI safety in China, what do you believe will be the most surprising to the largely Western listeners to this podcast?
Thank you, Wendell. First off, I just want to thank you and the team for having us on this podcast. And let me just take a moment here to set the scene. So in 2023, after the launch of ChatGPT, I think discussion on frontier AI safety and governance really took off. But there were some influential voices that have framed AI development as a zero-sum competition between China and some Western countries, arguing that China doesn't care or is unlikely to act to reduce AI risks. And this raises the question, right? Just how much does China actually care about the risks from frontier AI development, and will it take any meaningful actions to address these concerns? And our findings in the report suggest that China is more invested in AI safety and risk mitigation than many may realize. From China's domestic rules on generative AI and internationally directed the Global AI Governance Initiative to technical safety research and expert views on frontier risks, China is much more active on AI safety than many Western commentators might suppose. And as a result, I think international coordination is more feasible than many may think. In 2024, we're really going to witness an unprecedented level of international dialogue on this topic with the Global AI Safety Summit in South Korea and France this year, the UN's Summit of the Future, China-US Intergovernmental Dialogues on AI, and more. And as a leading AI power and critical player in international governance, China really should be part of this discussion. So at the moment, my wonderful colleague, Jason Zhou, is working hard to update our report. So maybe later in the discussion, we can also get into some more specific developments since last October when the report was initially released that might be interesting to the audience.
So Brian, what was most surprising to you as you did this research?
First of all, it's great to see you again, Wendell. So I agree with Kuan Yi that the Chinese ecosystem of AI safety and governance is richer and more diverse than many international audiences may realize. Some of you may already knew that China has introduced a series of targeted and binding regulations in recent years that include regulations on recommendation systems in 2021, the rules for deep synthesis or deep fakes in 2022, and the rules on generative AI in 2023. But there are also many more layers and approaches that China possesses for governing AI. For example, China had created a National Science and Technology Ethics Review, including for AI by 2023. New standards have also been issued on AI safety and security. We also found out that a number of key local governments from Beijing to the lesser-known Anhui province have issued AGI or large model policies with some safety and ethics provisions. And now China is debating and drafting an overarching national AI law that could be rolled out in the years ahead. And there are several expert groups that are drafting their own suggested versions of the national AI law. And this is just the domestic governance session, which is one of the 6 sessions in our State of AI Safety in China report. We internally expected the report to be about 50 pages long, but it turned out to be over 150 pages. So that was a surprise to me.
Yeah, I've also been surprised in the United States how robust the attention to these issues are, though I don't think we have anywhere near the legislation that China has put in place so far. But do you feel when you look at the report that you were surprised that there were so many things going on? I mean, you mentioned the length, and that's what we would presume by the length of the report. But did you find just a whole flurry of different activities going on that you never thought were taking place?
I think for us, we have been involved in doing AI safety and governance work domestically in China. So is not a big surprise to us, but we really hope to advance international cooperation and understanding by reducing the information asymmetry. What I mean is, in China, AI safety and governance experts follow what's happening with the EU AI Act or super alignment work at OpenAI on a daily basis. However, their international counterparts often know very little about relevant work in China. So when we published a report in English, this was really the first effort we are aware of that seeks to comprehensively map out the AI safety and policy landscape in China for an international audience. And we really felt that it was especially critical when experts and policymakers in the UK were deliberating and to some extent debating over whether the first Global AI Safety Summit should involve China during summer 2023. So at the time, we at Concordia AI believed that the summit represented a unique opportunity to bring major global powers, including China, around a table to discuss significant safety risks that would likely require international cooperation. And we believe that there are several concrete areas where there could be productive discussions and even agreements. So we really made a public case for this. For example, we thought that a top priority for the first Global AI Safety Summit would be to discussing the safety risks associated with frontier AI models and trying to agree to a shared statement. And eventually, when I personally attended the AI Safety Summit at the Bletchley Park, I was very glad to see that China, the US, the UK, EU, and more than 25 other countries signing on to the Bletchley Declaration.
So if I understand clearly, then this was never intended to be for a Chinese audience or be a survey for them. You feel that there's, within the safety community within China, there's a fairly good understanding of what's going on. This was always specifically directed at the international audience to make sure the international audience had a much better understanding of what was taking place in China in the hopes that that would open the door for more international cooperation. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's the core aim. While we mainly publish the report in English, we also release a article in Chinese, and many of our colleagues and collaborators in China also appreciated the efforts. In the process, we also consulted a number of experts and stakeholders in China, just to make sure that what we communicate and publish is in line with their understanding and is comprehensive in terms of the landscape.
Kuan-Yi, I know that you and Brian have already mentioned a number of the elements of the report, but perhaps you can provide us with a brief overview of AI safety and security research going on in China that might not have been talked about so far. I think we're talking about AI safety, security, and whether there's any work going on alignment research.
Yeah, of course. So I think just before diving into the report content, I'll just briefly define here what we mean by AI safety. And so for the report, we focused on safety risks from foundation models and frontier AI, which was also the focus of the Bletchley AI Safety Summit. And so concretely, AI systems have already demonstrated their potential to disrupt global security by enabling things like large-scale disinformation campaigns, cyber attacks, misuse of synthetic biology. And some have argued the horizon could also hold the prospect of more autonomous general purpose systems that could even escape human control. And so when we looked at Chinese materials, documents, speeches, surveys, etc., for this report, we focused on material that was oriented towards these kinds of risks. And so we divided, like Brian said, the report into 6 sections. And with regard to the safety alignment research, Wendell, you mentioned, I think the first takeaway here is that technical AI safety research in China has really become more advanced in just the last year. And so there are numerous Chinese labs across the country publishing papers on frontier safety related topics like model autonomy, safety evaluations, potential AI misuse in CBRN, and more. And I don't expect us to get into the technical details in this podcast, but 6 months on since the initial publication of our report in October, like I said, we're working on an updated version, and I just want to flag that really the sheer increase in volume and quality of technical safety research has really been one of our biggest updates since last October. And just briefly, a few other key takeaways. The second one is that with regard to industry, Chinese companies relative to their Western counterparts, have largely adopted a more passive approach to self-governance on frontier risks, but state-affiliated industry associations that coordinate between Chinese companies have been much more active. My third point here is that the weak data we could find shows the Chinese public generally seems to think that benefits from AI development outweigh the harms. But, and this is the fourth takeaway, leading Chinese experts, including like top scientists, policy advisors, they've expressed a lot more concerns about frontier AI risks. And just with the two other sections in our report, with domestic or international governance, over the last year, China's really stepped up its efforts to position AI governance as an area of international cooperation, especially with the release of the Global AI Governance Initiative last October by President Xi Jinping. Finally, China has developed domestic governance tools like an algorithm registry that, while they're not currently used to mitigate frontier risks, can be shaped and employed that way in the future.
So just for our audience's understanding, the term frontier applications or frontier research or frontier models, that's pretty well known within the technical circles, but outside of technical circles, people may not know what you're referring to. So you have both used those terms, and I just think maybe you will help the audience understand what you're talking about focusing upon, because you aren't necessarily talking about focusing on, let's say, technological unemployment when you use a term like that. So Guan Yi, maybe you can just clarify that for us for a moment.
No, you're right, Wendell. So when we talk about frontier AI risks, while we definitely think issues like technological employment are very important, when we talk about frontier risks, we're more focused on issues that could be brought about from models that are at the cutting edge of AI development at the moment. So an example of this would be GPT-4 or Claude 2 or Gemini, these generative AI systems that could have potentially a wide range of uses across different domains. But I mentioned earlier as well, there's also a concern about maybe some more narrow AI applications in safety critical areas. For example, the development of synthetic biology that could be used for great benefits like drug discovery, but could potentially be misused for example, developing toxic pathogens when in the hands of wrong actors.
Those are the convergence issues, the issues where AI may actually open the door for other technologies to be used in ways that are not necessarily being considered. But let me focus this a little bit more, because as I read the report, you are not focusing at all on military applications. That's not what your concern is here. You're really looking more at the applications of these generative models. Is that correct?
Yes, that's completely correct. Military applications is somewhat outside our domain of expertise, but we focus on models that could have potentially dual use applications in civilian cases as well.
And when you look at generative models, there's these questions around security, particularly of future systems, whether they are going to be controllable or not. If I'm understanding you correctly, you see the biggest threats from that coming from these generative models, and you're looking at that most specifically in terms of what the research is, it focuses on large language models and other generative AI applications. Is that correct?
That's exactly right.
So let's talk a little bit about these frontier models. What is the government doing to regulate their development in China, Brian?
So just as a big picture context, the China's National AI Plan in 2017 set the objective to begin developing local and sectorial specific regulations by 2020 and begin establishing AI laws and regulations by 2025. And between 2017 to 2020, we see binding AI regulations were confined to narrow application areas such as drones and self-driving cars. And then in 2021, the recommendation system regulations really represented the country's first broad regulation impacting AI. So as Guan Yi mentioned, the regulation created an important regulatory tool, a registry. So certain AI recommendation providers were now required to start kind of filing their systems and algorithms with the Cyberspace Administration of China. And security assessments were required for systems which could promote functions that could kind of destabilize society and mobilize public opinion. It really sought to address a mixed collection of social issues ranging from content control to privacy and algorithmic discrimination. And then later, we also saw regulations on deepfakes and generative AI in the last 2 years. They also require developers and providers to make a filing to the registry and also conduct security assessment. But they also introduce other safety relevant requirements, like mandating the watermarking of deep synthesis and other AI-generated content in order to address concerns around large-scale disinformation. While some of the earlier regulatory focus has been on content control, social stability, and data security, these regulatory tools could also be applied to regulating frontier AI risk. For example, if regulators become concerned about risk of the AI creating and generating harmful chemical substances, and I think they are increasingly demonstrating concerns in this direction, these concerns could fairly easily be folded into the existing registry system and the security assessment requirement.
Brian, you mentioned these different layers of governance, and I wonder if you could perhaps clarify that for the Western audience. I think some in the West have a very simplistic model of what governance is like in China, and that it's all just simply top down. But I think perhaps you can clarify for us what the different layers of governance are.
Sure. So in our report, we divide up the policy landscape in terms of different layers, ranging from the harder measures like binding regulations to softer measures like voluntary standards. So the first layer is what I talked about earlier in terms of binding regulations, like for generative AI. The second layer we talk about in the report is standards. While they are initially introduced as voluntary, regulators frequently cite them in their regulations. So over time, these standards can evolve into kind of de facto requirements for the industry. This kind of places the standards in a gray area between hard law and soft norms. The third layer is the science and technology ethics systems, which seems pretty unique to Chinese AI governance out of the major kind of AI jurisdictions like the Europe and the US. It really tries to incentivize AI developers to align their systems with ethical principles with a primary focus on bias and privacy, with some attention to human control as well. And this is not specific to AI, it's also for biotechnology and medical ethics. But at the moment, the system seems to be in the early stages of construction, and relatively little public information has emerged around how the system is to be operationalized. The fourth layer is around certifications, where third parties that are sometimes government affiliated test AI systems for attributes like safety and fairness. This area is quite exciting to look out for, as over the past year, there has been a lot of discussions around third-party evaluation for AI safety. And I think that closely relates to the establishment of national level AI safety institutions like the AI Safety Institute in the US and the UK. And over the past 6 months, there has been a lot of similar discussion in China around the need of a robust AI safety and security evaluation systems. One of the leading player is the China Academy of Information and Communication Technology, or what people usually call CAICT. They have been especially active in this regard. There are also numerous academic labs that are releasing benchmarks, evaluations, and are doing kind of red teaming around large language models. So I think this is a fairly robust and exciting area to look for. The final layer is local government action. Beyond the central level ministries that are driving kind of the top-down legislations, local provinces and governments have also initiated policies promoting and regulating AI applications around large foundation models. In our latest kind of spring edition of State of AI Safety in China report, we found that there are at least 6 local governments that have these policies since the release of ChatGPT. And in particular, for Shanghai and Guangdong province, they also propose creating kind of a national large model testing center. And so, China has a long tradition of trialing and experimenting policies at the local level before kind of introducing them nationally. And so we can already see a glance of what kind of the potential national policies might be like by analyzing the government action at the provincial and local level.
That's fascinating, particularly that the trials are going on at the local levels. You did mention soft law, which should be a familiar term to listeners of these podcasts, but for those that isn't familiar, soft law usually refers to standards, laboratory practices and procedures, professional codes of conduct, often insurance policies come into play, and other things that are not necessarily or seldom have any legally binding means of enforcement, but they actually do set a lot of the tone for how development of research goes. So you brought that out. In America, soft law can come out of countless institutions and academic consortium and other ways. Is that the same in China? I mean, do many different groups propose soft law, or does soft law come pretty much along with regulations from the primary regulatory bodies?
So the forms of soft law that Brian mentioned, for example, the standards, the certifications. So sometimes they're led by state-affiliated institutions like the CAICT, but the CAICT is also, say, a coordinating body for other industry and in some cases civilian organizations. For example, most recently, the CAICT just last week published a round of results from its AI safety benchmark, which evaluated a few large models on various questions for safety. And these models included both Chinese models, but also one Western model, Llama 2. And in this process, 17, I believe, different organizations were consulted to create this benchmark. And often in these cases, apart from just this example, in other certifications as well, industry is consulted in the process to develop the standards and certifications.
So industry is really informing or functioning as a driver of what's coming out of this more centralized institution, from what I gather. Can you share with us some of the other drivers that get governments to act or direct attention to the governments as to the need for action on the development of AI?
For sure. So one that's already been mentioned is social stability and content moderation, which is a key driver of the regulations that we've already talked about. But the second here is AI as an engine of economic growth. So as China's economy is undergoing structural changes and does face challenges in form of slowing growth, demographic changes, the government sees AI as a key component to boost productivity and maintain economic competitiveness. This focus on AI as an engine of growth is especially evident in recent policy statements and government work reports. For example, in this year's 2 sessions, China's premier called AI an important engine for the new productive forces. And the government work report this year also talks a lot about a new AI plus policy, which seems to place greater emphasis on AI applications in industry. But I just want to talk about here a third factor that I believe is often overlooked is genuine concerns about AI safety. And this is closely tied to very practical concerns here about national security and the safety of the Chinese people. The Chinese government recognizes that AI risks can threaten these aspects, and AI systems have the potential to be misused or behave in unintended ways. And this has been evident even at the highest levels of Chinese leadership. For example, last April, the Politburo, the top 25 or so highest ranking officials in China, they met. And the official meeting readout stated that China must attach importance to the development of artificial general intelligence, AGI, but it must also at the same time prioritize the prevention of risks associated with AGI. So to wrap up, while China is undoubtedly committed to advancing AI technology, the leadership is also driven to protect national security and the well-being of citizens by ensuring AI safety. And I think it's important to acknowledge that.
Right. That was one thing I noticed when I was in China, that the Chinese governments on all the levels were much more sensitive to what was coming from the bottom up, to public concerns. I mean, we noticed even during COVID, when there started to become really vocal protests against the lockdowns, that the lockdowns were removed very quickly. And I think that's something that we in the West do not understand about China, the extent to which it's trying to maintain the governments are trying to maintain their antenna on what the public feels and the public is concerned about, and tends to make relatively quick responses if they think those are in order.
That's right, Wendell. Can I just add a data point on this point?
Yeah.
Yeah, so when the initial draft for generative AI regulations came out in April 2023, it proposed very restrictive measures on the outputs of these chatbot models, right? One clause in the draft was requiring developers to ensure that the outputs are accurate and truthful. Basically, you can't contain any false information at all. And the Chinese industry felt that this would be just technically infeasible, given the persistent issue of hallucination we know in large language models. So after several months of public and industry consultations, those very restrictive measures were relaxed and rolled back in the final version that was released in August 2023. So I think this really illustrates that Chinese national policy does kind of responds to concerns and kind of feedback from the public and the industry.
That's very interesting. Government constraints on the corporation, from what I understand, is much more robust in China than comparably in the EU or North America. This seems to suggest there is concern, as there has been in North America and Europe, that robust regulations will stunt innovation and growth. Is this just one example of that, or is this the primary example of that?
So I think China is trying to have the best of both worlds when they look at the AI governance in the EU and the US. So when they look at the EU, the approach seems too restrictive, and the EU doesn't have a thriving domestic innovation ecosystem as compared to the US and China. And when they look at the US, it doesn't yet have binding regulations, and the voices and the incentives from the industry tend to be quite dominant. So on balance, I think the mainstream AI governance view in China is that robust governance and policy of AI is needed in order to promote responsible industry innovation, but also ensure public safety at the same time. In addition, China is also keenly aware of the needs of developing countries and believe that responsible AI innovation can help the world meet some of the sustainable development goals.
Can I just add a point to this as well, Wendell? I think there's a lot of room to debate on the degree to this, but I do think we need government regulation to restrain companies to some extent. As we saw from the OpenAI board incident last year, we can't always rely on private companies to responsibly self-govern. And in recent years, we've seen intense competition between AI developers to quickly build and deploy their AI systems. And this competition, I think, has raised valid concerns about potential race to the bottom scenarios where actors compete to develop AI systems as soon as possible while corner cutting on safety. And it can be really challenging in such situations for AI developers to unilaterally by themselves commit to stringent safety standards, because this could put them at a competitive disadvantage. And so this could be where it could be helpful for governments to step in and coordinate commitments. And also, regulation does not have to be at odds with innovation and progress. In fact, regulation can empower safe development. For example, take Anthropic's responsible scaling policy, where they recognize that the more powerful models can bring greater beneficial applications. So their policy isn't to prohibit development, but to enable the development and use of models with the appropriate precautions in place.
Well, as I understand it, the governmental policy is a carrot and a stick approach, that the carrot is a tremendous amount of funding going into AI research. And the stick, of course, is that you have a bit more robust regulation of particularly the corporations than we are seeing elsewhere in the world. Is that kind of your perception of what's going on?
So in terms of the industry, if we look at kind of the large language models or generative AI landscape, there are now more than 200 models as of early 2024. And there are at least 3 categories of developers with varying incentives and relationship with the government. So first, there are the large technology companies like Baidu or Alibaba. They developed and invest in AI to improve their current products and services, such as search engines for Baidu. And this is quite similar to Google or Microsoft. And some of them have also started to explore the overseas market, for example, using these large models in e-commerce services in Southeast Asia by Alibaba. Second, there are also venture-backed startups like Zhipu AI that developed ChatGRM or Moonshot AI that developed Kimi. By the way, both of these projects are kind of part-time startups by professors affiliated with Tsinghua University. And they may have a kind of tech vision of pushing the boundaries of developing artificial general intelligence and would often aspire to be kind of the OpenAI in China. And then finally, there are also kind of government-backed labs like the Beijing Academy of AI or Shanghai AI Lab. They do not have the short-term commercial incentive for building products or getting venture capital funding, and they often work very closely with academia in China. So I think this is also part of the reason why Shanghai AI Lab has emerged as a key player for frontier AI safety research. And this type of player doesn't really exist in many of the other major AI jurisdictions.
What is your subjective sense of the robustness of the research going on in AI safety and AI security? I know many of us in America think that for all the talk about AI safety and security, very little funding is going into the research compared to the expansion of the frontier models, and that not only very little money is going into the research, but the research is dominated by the corporate elite, which are going to get the benefits from that research. So they may not actually want robust regulations that get in the way of their doing what is in their economic interests. So I'm just trying to get a feel from the two of you subjectively. Do you feel that the research going on in these fields is adequately robust, or would you like to see much more funding going into the safety and security side of AI development?
I certainly think that the AI safety ecosystem could be more robust, both within China and globally. For example, we should have much more funding for AI safety relative to investment in capabilities. I think globally, AI safety account for less than 5% of the total R&D going into AI. And over the last 6 months, numerous consensus statements from top scientists have suggested that this level should be increased to 30% of the total AI R&D. And I also think that this cannot be dominated by a few tech companies that are driven by commercial incentive. So I also think we need to have a robust international ecosystem of third-party auditors, international organizations, nonprofits that help ensure that the risks of AI are mitigated and also the benefits of AI can be equally distributed around the world. I think this is an ambitious vision, but I think we should try.
Let's come back to that vision a little bit further on. But how about you, Quan Yi? What is your sense of the robustness of the development? Do you agree with Brian that you'd like to see perhaps as much as 30% of investment going toward AI safety and security, or do you have a somewhat different sense of what's going on?
Yes, so I definitely do want to see an increased investment in AI safety and AI governance resources. I don't have a strong opinion, to be honest, about the exact percentage. I think this is also a place where we could really get into debates on splitting hairs on the exact percentages that companies, public funders should dedicate. But I do think that more investment is certainly needed for a more robust ecosystem. But with regard to the robustness of the AI safety research going on in China, like I mentioned earlier, I really do think technical safety research has blossomed in China over the past year. And so there are now over a dozen research groups in the country working on various aspects of safety, including alignment, robustness assurance, evaluations. And one data point, one anecdote here is, so we work on a biweekly, every 2 weeks, we publish a newsletter on the state of AI safety in China. And just for very recently, we were looking at the latest papers coming out from Chinese research groups on technical AI safety. And we had over, say, 30 publications. It was a ridiculous amount. We couldn't possibly cover that in our newsletter, but that's also the sheer volume that is coming out. And I really think some of the quality of that research is also rapidly improving. For example, there was a paper among mostly championed by researchers at Microsoft Research Asia on the risks of, or mitigating the risks of AI misuse in scientific fields. And this is just already a very early emerging, burgeoning area of discussion in around the world. And to have such research coming out of China at this early stage is, I think, incredibly promising.
That's great. So, I mean, you're just seeing a significant ramping up of attention to these concerns in AI safety. And is that what you've also seen since the first report? I mean, has anything else come up that you want to underscore between the first report that you're going to get into this update beyond just the expansion of attention and projects that working in this area?
Yes, I think another area of update is just the robustness of discussions among Chinese experts. So in our first report in October, we already outlined the sort of evolution, the historical evolution on Chinese expert discourse on AI safety, from even starting like around 2016 with the development of AlphaGo, fairly little discussion going on, even some Chinese media deriding discussions about AI threats as AI threat theory. But over the past year, this has become much more a vociferous sort of field of discussion. And just for example, over the past month, Xie Lan, who's the head of Tsinghua University's Institute for AI International Governance, he suggested in a roundtable to focus on bottom lines on AI risks in international discussions, given quote unquote obvious interest in things like preventing loss of control over AI among countries. And similarly, Gao Wen, academician Gao Wen, who's the director of the National Pengcheng Lab, previously who presented on AI to President Xi Jinping and has written and spoken multiple times on AI risks and potential risk prevention strategies. He's also talked about these topics more recently as well. And so I really think the Chinese AI expert discourse has continued and flourished over the past few months. I can't talk about all the senior Chinese experts who've expressed concerns about frontier AI in this podcast, obviously, but there's a website called ChinesePerspectives.ai that contains profiles of these Chinese experts and their statements on AI risks if people would want to look further as well.
Those people you have talked about have been colleagues of ours, and I've known particularly Shui Lan for many, many years, and they have been friends of the AI Inequality Initiative. So it's kind of thrilling to see this go forward. Also, Yi Zhang, who works very closely with that group and is a member of the UN AI consultative body, is one of the advisors to this project. So that's just great in terms of, I think that gives you some hope that we're moving in the right trajectory. At least in China, we're moving in the right trajectory. Maybe I can go to the negative side with you a little bit. And this doesn't have to be China specific for you in your response, but maybe you'll start this one, Brian. What keeps you up at night?
Yes, that's a great question, Wendell. I think what keeps me up at night is the accelerating progress of AI and the inability for global institutions to keep up with this pace. And so if we look at the pace of AI progress before the deep learning era, AI computational power was doubling approximately every 2 years in line with Moore's law. And since 2012, this growth has dramatically accelerated to a doubling every 3 to 4 months, exceeding Moore's law by a lot. And I also think the recent pace of progress has really caught most of the world by surprise. So before GPT-3 was released, expert forecasters expected that it would take another 80 years to develop human-level general AI systems. And after GPT-3 in 2020, the average forecast was shortened to 50 years. And then after ChatGPT in 2023, that was shortened further to less than 10 years. And I think that our human psychology and social institutions are really inclined towards linear thinking. And exponential growth from emerging technologies like AI doesn't really align with this linear perspective. Of course, this doesn't apply just to AI. We see that many governments and societies around the world really struggle to predict and manage COVID as the infection rates increase exponentially. So I think the challenge is, how do we create a robust global ecosystem in AI safety and governance, and also international cooperation that keep pace with this exponential progress from AI?
How about you, Kuan Yi? What keeps you up at night?
Yeah, I think making sure the global majority is included in AI safety and governance conversations is hugely important and neglected at the moment. Just want to put an asterisk here. I'm not an expert in this area, but I think that regulation can't be pushed forward by policy elites and technology companies alone, and we must consider the interests of ordinary citizens and developing countries as well. And so we should ensure equal rights, opportunities, rules for all countries in AI development and governance. And we know that the development of frontier AI systems will be transformational for all of humanity. So giving everyone a say in this process is morally critical. And I think there's a practical side to this as well, where the cost of training AI is going down because of lower compute costs, progress in algorithms, and it's also pretty tough to prevent model weights from being stolen or leaked at the moment. And so while at the moment we might see powerful capabilities concentrated in the hands of wealthy countries, this might not be the case in the longer term. And we might also see powerful capabilities proliferate to actors in the global majority and even non-state actors. And I think another point here about the practical importance is that major AI nations might also link their agreement on governance frameworks to ensuring access for their allies. For example, the Chinese government actively promotes wide access to AI technologies for developing countries through international fora like the United Nations, through policy documents. And so I think we should really consider how we could share the benefits of AI widely and ensure equal participation in governance. So given the role of China as a major member of the developing world, but also a leading AI power, it could have a particularly strong role to play on this issue. And one early idea is to incorporate underrepresented languages in large models, like the Chinese Pengcheng Lab is currently doing, creating a data set on languages across the Belt and Road Initiative. Another idea is to foster AI safety and R&D talent, especially from underrepresented groups.
But as I understand, that's mainly focused on China or the countries that it is in alliance with on the Belt and Road Initiative. Is that correct?
So I believe that is the case for Pengcheng Lab's project, but there are other examples of projects in this sort of direction. For example, there's Project SEALD, I believe SEALD, that is doing the same for Southeast Asian languages, for example. And there's a project by the Maori Data Sovereignty Network that is trying to do something similar as well.
So both of you have been referring quite often to international governance as one of the elements that we need in moving forward. And as you know, the AI Inequality Initiative and Anya and my work has been particularly focused on that element, at least, well, for myself, for many years now. There's always this difficulty in it in terms of how China is perceived in regards to international regulations and whether it would come to the table, or perhaps more importantly, whether some of the Western countries, particularly the United States, necessarily want it at the table or want it at the table for what reasons. And perhaps you could tell us a few things about what you think your government is actually doing to promote international cooperation, and what additional steps you think need to take place for some degree of international cooperation to come about, not just in standards, but in ongoing meetings and putting in some robust controls or limits on some of the more dangerous applications. You want to start with that, Brian?
So, first of all, I just want to say that the Chinese AI ecosystem probably has more desire and willingness to work with the international community on AI safety than many expected. I think this is becoming more evident since we published the first report in October. We can just look at a few of these developments. So China signed on to the Bletchley Declaration at the first Global AI Safety Summit, as I mentioned. Then it also supported launching the International Scientific Report on Advanced AI Safety chaired by Yoshua Bengio. This is equivalent to the kind of IPCC for climate change. And then when the US initiated the first UN General Assembly resolution on AI, China, along with 120 other countries, co-sponsored the idea. And then when President Xi met with President Biden in San Francisco, they also agreed to launch intergovernmental talks on AI, including AI safety. And then there are a number of AI safety consensus statements coming out from top Chinese and Western academics, including 3 Turing Award winners. So I think these developments over the last 6 months really show that international cooperation, including between China and the US, on AI safety, this is possible. I think this is a key message that I would like to communicate with the audience. And perhaps Kuan Yi could share a bit more about some of the suggestions and recommendations we have.
I'm happy to do that, but I just want to add a few more notes on what China's been doing with regard to international AI governance first. So, Wendell, you mentioned participation with regard to ethical principles, standard setting, and that's certainly been the case that China's been active in these areas since 2016 even, but I think last year really marked a phase shift in China's efforts to step up in international AI governance. For example, last April, China elevated international cooperation on AI governance within one of China's flagship foreign policy programs, the Global Security Initiative. And then last October, President Xi Jinping announced the Global AI Governance Initiative, which sets out China's core positions and values on AI development and areas for international cooperation on AI. But regardless, much of global AI governance remains fractured across geopolitical fault lines. And in response, China has been advocating for what it calls, quote unquote, true multilateralism, which primarily emphasizes the central role of the United Nations and greater representation of developing countries. And there could be a concern here, right, where, well, definitely parallel AI governance efforts need not be conflicting to each other. Continued exclusion of China can lead to parallel AI governance efforts, and this might hinder the necessary coordination needed for joint efforts on AI safety. And we've seen this through, say, over the past 2 years. BRICS has made multiple announcements relating to AI, including creating an AI study group, and the Global AI Governance Initiative was also notably unveiled at the Belt and Road Forum. But at the same time, I'd say that China's positions on maintaining human control over AI systems and preventing their misuse by terrorists could be areas for international cooperation. Just, for example, ensuring human control, this has been a consistent element in China's domestic AI policy documents and also in its expressions on the international stage. For example, in 2021, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs submitted a position paper to the UN Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, where China called for relevant weapon systems to remain under human control. And since then, China has expanded this position to include non-military systems as well, with this Global AI Governance Initiative calling for all AI research entities to ensure human control over AI. And the initiative also explicitly calls for international collaboration on terrorist misuse of AI, which mirrors concerns, say, expressed by UN Secretary General Guterres and UN representatives from countries including Japan, Mozambique, Ghana, when AI risks was discussed for the first time at the UN Security Council last summer 2023.
This is great. I think this is very important that the Western audience, and particularly the audience we have for these podcasts, which are largely those interested in international affairs, is aware that There are many opportunities for cooperation here, and there have been some steps taken forward. Of course, detractors are going to point out what hasn't happened or what has failed. For example, recent meetings on regulating or, in effect, outlawing lethal autonomous weapons to carry nuclear weapons failed. I don't think we need to get into the technicalities over the disagreements, but you would have thought that would have been one of the most obvious agreements that the countries could have come to. Of course, that's a different area than your bailiwick. I know that you're not focused on the military applications so much, but we're probably going to have to get over some hump as far as the regulation of lethal autonomous weapons before we can even focus more on some of the joint research. We're coming to the end of our time together, but I think you have been wonderfully informative. I wonder whether we can just finish up with you sharing some thoughts or other points you would like to bring up with our audience here. Juani, why don't you start out with that?
Yeah, thank you for that, Wendell. I think I just want to close up with some concrete recommendations on our side for international cooperation on AI safety and governance. And we could maybe also discuss some of these ideas. I would be curious to hear your thoughts on this as well, Wendell. But one idea we have here is focusing on dual risks. So you mentioned that there have been difficulties in getting to terms with agreements on the uses of AI in military, but we do recognize that cutting edge AI systems are approaching human level performance in a range of safety critical domains. And it's incredibly important for the international community to agree on a set of, say, red lines, bottom lines on AI development. And maybe there has been some difficulties getting to agreements on the international stage, but in a recent international dialogue in Beijing, top scientific experts and policy experts as well agreed on 5 red lines and released a consensus statement, including that AI should never be used to help with designing biological weapons, launching cyber attacks, or autonomously self-replicate. And so upon agreeing on these red lines, we could consider having an international network of partners for AI safety evaluations and testing. And this could help with sharing information about emergent risks and eventually develop into shared standards. So one example is just recently the US and UK AI safety institutes signed an MOU, a memorandum of understanding, to develop a shared approach to evaluations and commit to jointly testing a publicly accessible model. And this kind of partnership could be expanded internationally as well. And so flowing on from that, the results of AI safety evaluations testing could also feed into decisions on whether and how to scale up large models responsibly. So I mentioned earlier Anthropic's responsible scaling policy, similar to biosafety labs with higher stakes research and development, could have more stringent safety protocols and practices with an analogy to, say, biosecurity level 3 for labs. And this could help with balancing both the needs for promoting innovation and managing risks. And we could hope to see international standards along this vein as well.
Yeah, I think this is a great idea. I'm actually sad to see it start up from the bottom up, meaning the US and the UK. I think these are the kinds of initiatives that I'm hopeful will come out of the UN. I'm a little skeptical whether they will come out of the UN, but I'm hopeful. It's this list of recommendations for international cooperation around exactly initiatives like the one you have outlined is where we go, and we get there quite quickly. Brian, what about you? What would you like to share with our audience before we close?
I think I have felt a little bit more hopeful about the trajectory of AI safety and governance over the past year. Right now, world leaders and major institutions around the world are seriously thinking about the opportunities and risks posed by advances in AI. And there are certainly people who are skeptical of greater cooperation between major AI powers on AI safety. But in response, I would say 2 things. One is that the US and the Soviet Union have managed to tackle global challenges. When they realized the potential catastrophic risks from global nuclear war, they came together to agree on a set of disarmament and non-proliferation treaties. And even at the height of the Cold War, they worked together to eradicate smallpox, which was an incredible achievement. And second, I think the US and China in the 21st century can do much better than the Cold War. There is enduring interdependence between the world's two largest economies. There is more cooperation to publish AI papers between the US and China than any other pairs in the world, more than even between the US and the UK. And both countries, governments, and their people really desire and benefit from global stability, not chaos. And so if we look at the trajectory of international dialogue on AI safety over the last 6 to 12 months, I really think that there is reason for hope.